10 attempts. 10 failures. The entire platoon watching as the range master was called in to fix what everyone assumed was a faulty rifle. But when a quiet private with trembling hands stepped up to that firing line, something impossible happened. A single shot. 4,500 meters. Dead center. The silence that followed wasn't just shock, it was the sound of every assumption shattering. This is the story of Elena Kovač, the soldier they laughed at, the woman they dismissed, and the shooter who rewrote the record books when no one was looking. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out, subscribe now for more. The morning sun cast long shadows across the firing range at Camp Steiner, a military installation nestled in the Austrian Alps where precision was religion and marksmanship was measured in millimeters. Elena Kovač arrived at the range 30 minutes before the scheduled qualification shoot, just as she did every morning, her boots crunching softly on the gravel path that wound between the ammunition depot and the observation tower. At 23, Elena stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with a slight frame that made her standard-issue uniform hang loose around her shoulders. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her pale gray eyes carried a quiet intensity that most people mistook for nervousness. She'd been stationed at Camp Steiner for 11 months, assigned to the quartermaster corps where she managed inventory and filed requisition orders while others trained for combat operations. The range was already buzzing with activity when she slipped into the equipment shed. Sergeant Weber stood near the firing line, clipboard in hand, barking instructions to the early arrivals. He was a bear of a man, with shoulders like a mountain range and a voice that could crack stone. Next to him, Corporal Dietrich was setting up target stands at various distances, his movements efficient and practiced. Elena moved through the shed with practiced ease, checking equipment that wasn't technically her responsibility. She verified the 0 on 3 rifles, confirmed that the ammunition lots matched the weapons being used, and made mental notes about wind conditions and temperature variations that would affect bullet trajectory. Nobody had asked her to do this. Nobody knew she was doing it. But Elena had learned long ago that being prepared for opportunity was better than waiting for permission. Kovač. Weber's voice cut through the morning air like a whip crack. What are you doing in the equipment shed? Your duty station is at the supply office, not the firing range. Elena stepped out into the sunlight, squinting slightly. Just conducting an inventory check, Sergeant. Making sure all equipment is accounted for before the qualification shoot. Weber's expression softened slightly, though his tone remained gruff. Well, get it done and clear out. We've got real shooters coming through today, and I don't need logistics personnel cluttering out my range. Real shooters. The words stung, but Elena kept her face neutral. She'd heard variations of this dismissal countless times. Too small for combat roles. Too quiet for leadership positions. Too focused on details that didn't matter. The fact that she could field strip and reassemble any weapon in the armory blindfolded, or that she'd memorized ballistic tables for every rifle and ammunition combination used on the base, was irrelevant. She was logistics, and logistics didn't shoot. As she walked back toward the supply office, Elena passed a group of soldiers from the infantry platoon. They were gathered near the 800-meter range, laughing and exchanging predictions about who would score highest in today's qualification. I'm calling it now, Private Hoffman announced loudly. I'm shooting expert today. Maybe even break the base record if the wind cooperates. You couldn't hit expert if the target was 10 meters away, another soldier joked, prompting a round of laughter. Elena kept walking, but her mind was already calculating. The base record for the 800-meter qualification was 96 out of 100 possible points, set 3 years ago by a sniper who'd since transferred to special operations. Breaking it would require not just accuracy but an understanding of environmental factors that most soldiers never bothered to study. Wind speed and direction, temperature gradients, even the rotation of the Earth at extended ranges, all variables that separated good shooters from exceptional ones. She'd studied those variables obsessively for months. Not because anyone had asked her to, but because understanding the science of precision shooting had become her private obsession. While other soldiers spent their off-duty hours at the recreation center or in town, Elena was in the base library, reading treatises on external ballistics, studying atmospheric effects on bullet flight, and analyzing historical long-range shooting records. Her quarters were filled with notebooks covered in calculations, trajectory charts, and wind estimation formulas. She'd built a mental database of every successful long-range shot in military history, understanding not just the mechanics but the psychology, the preparation, the moment when doubt transformed into certainty. Nobody knew about this private education. They saw her as Elena from logistics, the quiet woman who counted rifles and filled out paperwork. The supply office was a small, climate-controlled building that smelled of gun oil and cardboard. Elena's desk sat in the corner, surrounded by filing cabinets and equipment manifests. Lieutenant Brenner, her supervisor, looked up from his computer as she entered. "Morning, Kovač. How's the inventory looking for today's qualification shoot?" "Everything's accounted for, sir. All weapons are properly maintained, ammunition lots are matched to the appropriate firearms, and environmental conditions are favorable for accurate shooting." Brenner raised an eyebrow. "Environmental conditions? Since when is that part of your job description?" Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Just trying to be thorough, sir." "Well, don't be too thorough. We need you focused on logistics, not trying to be a range master." He turned back to his computer, dismissing her with practiced indifference. Elena sat at her desk and pulled up the day's requisition orders, but her mind was elsewhere. Through the window, she could see soldiers gathering at the firing line, preparing for the qualification shoot that would determine their marksmanship ratings for the year. She watched them joke and posture, confident in their skills, secure in their roles as combat soldiers. None of them had spent hundreds of hours studying the art of precision shooting. None of them had sacrificed sleep to understand the complex mathematics of long-range marksmanship. And none of them would ever know that the quiet logistics specialist watching from the supply office window could probably outshoot every one of them, if only she were given the chance. But chances weren't given to people like Elena. They were earned through persistence, preparation, and the willingness to prove everyone wrong. She'd learned that lesson early in her military career, and she'd never forgotten it. So she continued her secret education, continued her private preparation, and waited for the moment when being ready would matter more than being invited. The qualification shoot began at 0800 hours with Weber's voice echoing across the range like thunder rolling through the mountains. 43 soldiers from various units had gathered for the annual marksmanship assessment, each hoping to earn expert qualification and the accompanying badge that signified superior shooting ability. Elena watched from the supply office window as the first group took their positions at the 300-meter line. The qualification course was standardized, progressing from closer targets to more distant ones, with points awarded for accuracy and consistency. A perfect score of 100 was rare, expert qualification required 90 or above, and anything less than 75 was considered a failure that would necessitate additional training. The morning progressed smoothly at first. Soldiers fired their allotted rounds, their scores were recorded, and the range operated with the efficient rhythm that Weber demanded. But as the distances increased and the targets became smaller, the mood shifted from confidence to frustration. Private Hoffman, who'd boasted about breaking the base record, managed only 73 points, barely avoiding failure. His face was red with embarrassment as he left the firing line, his earlier bravado deflated. Others fared better but not by much. The average score hovered around 82, respectable but far from exceptional. By mid-morning, Weber was pacing behind the firing line like a caged animal, his frustration evident in every sharp command and critical comment. "This is pathetic," he shouted after a soldier missed 3 consecutive shots at 600 meters. "My grandmother could shoot better than this, and she's been dead for 10 years. Elena continued her work in the supply office, processing requisition orders and updating inventory databases, but her attention was divided. She'd positioned her desk to maintain a clear view of the range, and she found herself analyzing each shooter's technique, identifying the small errors that cost them points. Improper breathing control. Inconsistent trigger pull. Failure to account for wind drift. These weren't complex problems, but they required understanding and practice to correct. Lieutenant Brenner left for an early lunch, leaving Elena alone in the office. She took the opportunity to step outside, ostensibly to check on equipment storage but actually to get a closer view of the qualification chute. She positioned herself near the observation tower, far enough from the firing line to avoid Weber's attention but close enough to see the targets through the spotting scopes. The afternoon session brought a new challenge. Weber announced that they would be attempting the extended range qualification, an optional test that only the most confident shooters attempted. The target was positioned at 1,200 meters, more than twice the distance of the standard course, and hitting it consistently required skills that few soldiers possessed. "All right, listen up," Weber called out. "Extended range is voluntary, but if you qualify, it goes on your permanent record. Who's got the skill to attempt it?" 8 soldiers stepped forward, including Corporal Dietrich and a few others who'd scored expert on the standard course. Elena felt her pulse quicken. She'd studied 1,200-meter shots extensively, understood the complexities involved, the way wind became exponentially more significant at extended ranges, how even slight variations in ammunition could cause misses measured in meters rather than centimeters. The first shooter took position, adjusted his scope, and fired 3 rounds. All 3 missed, the impacts visible in the dirt well short of the target. The second shooter fared no better. His rounds landed high and right, victims of wind drift he'd failed to calculate. One by one, the volunteers attempted the extended range target and one by one they failed. Dietrich came closest, landing 2 of his 5 rounds on the target frame, though neither struck the scoring rings. Weber's frustration reached a boiling point. "This is embarrassing. We've got soldiers who can't hit a target the size of a small car at 1,200 meters. What happens when you need to engage enemy positions at distance? You going to tell them to come closer so you can actually hit something?" Elena found herself calculating without conscious thought. Wind was 7 kilometers per hour from the northwest, temperature was 22 degrees Celsius, humidity at 65%. At 1,200 meters, the bullet would drop approximately 14 meters from the bore line and drift roughly 40 centimeters right. The scope adjustment would need to account for both, plus a slight correction for the Coriolis effect at this latitude. She realized she'd been muttering the calculations under her breath and quickly fell silent, but not before catching the attention of a nearby soldier who'd been watching the failed attempts with amusement. "You think you could do better?" Private Richter asked, his tone mocking. "Little logistics girl thinks she knows about shooting?" Elena met his gaze steadily. "I think anyone could do better with proper preparation and understanding of external ballistics." Richter laughed. "External ballistics. Listen to her using big words. Weber. The supply clerk thinks she's a marksman." Weber turned, his face still red from yelling at the failed shooters. "What's this about, Richter?" Kovač here was mumbling calculations about wind drift and bullet drop. "I think she wants to show us how it's done." The entire range fell silent. 40 pairs of eyes turned toward Elena, most filled with curiosity, some with barely concealed amusement. She felt her stomach tighten, knowing she'd been caught in her private obsession, exposed before she was ready. Weber's expression shifted from anger to something approaching pity. "Kovač, your logistics. You count equipment, you don't shoot it. Get back to your office and let the real soldiers finish their qualification." The dismissal was final, absolute. Elena nodded stiffly and turned away, feeling the weight of their judgment pressing down on her shoulders. As she walked back toward the supply office, she heard Richter's voice carry across the range. "At least she knows her place." But the humiliation that burned in Elena's chest wasn't just about being dismissed. It was about knowing she could have hit that target, could have demonstrated the skills she developed in secret, and being denied the opportunity because of assumptions about who she was and what she was capable of. Back in the office, Elena sat at her desk and stared at her computer screen without seeing it. Outside, the qualification chute continued, each failed attempt at the extended range a reminder of opportunity lost. She'd spent months preparing for a moment that might never come, developing skills that no one believed she possessed. As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, Elena made a decision. She would continue her preparation, continue her private education in marksmanship. And when the opportunity finally presented itself, if it ever did, she would be ready to prove that size, gender, and assigned duties didn't determine capability. Only skill did. She just had to wait for that opportunity. And hope it came before she was transferred to some other base where logistics specialists were kept even further from the firing line. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. 3 days after the qualification disaster, Elena noticed the change in how people looked at her. The incident at the range had spread through the base like wildfire, transformed through retelling into a story that made her seem presumptuous rather than knowledgeable. She first encountered it during morning formation when 2 soldiers from the infantry platoon stopped talking abruptly as she passed. Their silence was louder than any words, heavy with judgment and barely concealed amusement. Elena kept walking, her face neutral, but the message was clear. She'd overstepped, revealed herself as someone who didn't know her place. The whispers followed her everywhere. In the mess hall, conversations died when she approached tables. At the supply depot, requisition requests that normally took minutes to process suddenly required additional verification and supervisor approval. Even Lieutenant Brenner seemed distant, his usual professional courtesy replaced with a coolness that suggested disappointment. The breaking point came during a logistics briefing when Brenner addressed the assembled supply personnel. "I want to remind everyone that our job is to support combat operations, not to pretend we're combat soldiers ourselves. There's been some confusion about roles recently, and I need that cleared up immediately." He didn't look at Elena, but everyone else did. The message was unmistakable. Stay in your lane. Accept your limitations. Stop reaching for things beyond your designated purpose. After the briefing, Elena retreated to the equipment storage area, ostensibly to conduct inventory but actually to escape the weight of their judgment. She found herself standing among the rifles, running her hands over the familiar contours of weapons she'd maintained but never been allowed to fire in any official capacity. Corporal Anna Schneider found her there 20 minutes later. Anna was one of the few other women on the base, a medic who'd earned respect through quiet competence rather than confrontation. "They're being pretty rough on you," Anna said softly, leaning against a storage rack. "I shouldn't have said anything at the range," Elena replied, her voice flat. "I should have just kept quiet." "Why? Because you know something they don't?" Anna shook her head. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that keeps people in boxes. You studied marksmanship because you're interested in it. That's not a crime. It is when you're supposed to be counting equipment instead of understanding how to use it." Anna was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Can you really make those calculations? The wind drift and bullet drop stuff?" Elena nodded. "It's just physics and mathematics. Anyone could learn it with enough study. But you did learn it. Without anyone asking you to, without any expectation of reward." Anna smiled slightly. "That's not presumption, Elena. That's dedication." The words offered small comfort, but they couldn't change the reality of her situation. Elena had revealed a skill that her role didn't require, demonstrated knowledge that challenged assumptions about what logistics personnel should know. The base had responded by reminding her firmly of her place in the hierarchy. That evening, Elena sat in her quarters with her notebooks spread across the small desk. Months of calculations, trajectory charts, and ballistic data filled the pages, a private education that had cost her countless hours of sleep and study. She thought about putting them away, about accepting the limitations others had placed on her and focusing solely on her assigned duties. Instead, she pulled out a fresh notebook and began a new set of calculations. If she was going to be judged for her knowledge, she might as well make that knowledge as complete as possible. The 1,200-meter target had been challenging, but there were greater distances, more complex problems. She began researching extreme long-range shooting, the kind that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. Targets at 2,000 meters, 3,000 meters, distances where every environmental factor became magnified, where the slightest miscalculation meant missing by meters rather than centimeters. As she worked through the mathematics, Elena felt the familiar focus settle over her. This was where she belonged, not in social hierarchies or political maneuvering, but in the clean certainty of numbers and physics. Out here, skill mattered more than perception. Results spoke louder than assumptions. She just needed an opportunity to prove it. And when that opportunity came, she would be ready, no matter what anyone else believed about her capabilities. The announcement came during morning formation 2 weeks after Elena's humiliation at the range. Major General Klaus Hoffmann, commander of the Regional Training Center, stood before the assembled personnel with news that sent ripples of excitement through the ranks. As many of you know, Hoffmann began, his voice carrying across the parade ground, "Our facility has been selected to host the Alpine Marksmanship Challenge next month. This competition brings together the finest shooters from military installations across Europe. It's an opportunity to demonstrate the excellence of Austrian military training." Elena listened with mild interest, knowing that logistics personnel wouldn't be considered for such a prestigious event. The challenge was reserved for designated marksmen and soldiers who'd proven themselves on the firing line, not supply clerks who counted rifles instead of shooting them. The competition includes standard marksmanship events, Hoffmann continued, but this year, there's a new element. A demonstration shoot at extreme long range. The organizing committee has established a target at 4,500 meters, and they're inviting each installation to attempt it. No points, no prizes, just the opportunity to demonstrate the outer limits of military marksmanship capability. 4,500 meters. Elena's mind immediately began calculating. At that distance, the bullet would be in flight for nearly 7 seconds. It would drop over 500 meters from the bore line. Wind drift could measure in tens of meters. The Coriolis effect would be significant. It was less shooting than orchestrating a small ballistic miracle. Sergeant Weber will be conducting trials next week to select our shooters, Hoffmann announced. Any qualified marksman who wishes to attempt the extreme long-range demonstration may volunteer. The formation dispersed with excited chatter. Elena heard soldiers already debating who would be selected, which weapons would be used, whether anyone could actually hit a target at such an impossible distance. The consensus seemed to be that it was more spectacle than serious shooting, a way to generate publicity rather than demonstrate practical skill. Elena returned to the supply office, but her mind remained fixed on the problem. 4,500 meters. She pulled up ballistic software on her personal tablet, began running simulations with different ammunition types, different atmospheric conditions. The mathematics were complex but not impossible. It would require perfect understanding of every environmental variable, flawless execution, and a degree of precision that left no room for error. Over the next 3 days, Elena became obsessed with the problem. She calculated trajectories until the numbers blurred together. She studied historical long-range shots, analyzing what had worked and what had failed. She even created a predictive model that could estimate point of impact based on real-time environmental data. Her work didn't go unnoticed. Lieutenant Brenner found her one afternoon with her tablet covered in ballistic charts instead of inventory spreadsheets. "Kovač, are you working on supply requisitions or playing with shooting calculations?" Elena closed the tablet quickly. "Just curious about the extreme long-range demonstration, sir." Brenner's expression hardened. "We talked about this. Your job is logistics, not marksmanship. I need you focused on your actual duties, not chasing fantasies about being a competitive shooter." "Yes, sir." It won't happen again. But it did happen again, every night in her quarters, every spare moment she could find. Elena couldn't let go of the problem. 4,500 meters represented a challenge that demanded solution, a puzzle that required all the knowledge she'd accumulated over months of private study. The trials for the Alpine Marksmanship Challenge began on a crisp morning with perfect visibility. Weber had set up a temporary range extending far into the valley beyond the base, with targets at progressively longer distances. 15 soldiers had volunteered to attempt qualification, each confident in their abilities. Elena watched from a distance, officially present to manage equipment inventory but actually studying every attempt. The shooters started at 800 meters, progressing to 1,200, then 1,800. Each distance eliminated more candidates. By the time they reached 2,400 meters, only 3 soldiers remained qualified to continue. "This is where it gets interesting," Weber announced to the remaining shooters. "At this distance, you're not just aiming. You're predicting where the bullet will be after accounting for every environmental factor. Wind, temperature, humidity, even the rotation of the Earth matters." The first shooter attempted the 2,400-meter target and missed by 5 meters. The second came closer but still failed to hit the scoring rings. The third soldier, a designated marksman named Friedrich who'd trained at advanced sniper schools, managed to land 2 of 5 rounds on target, earning applause from the gathered observers. Weber nodded approvingly. "Friedrich, you'll be our primary shooter for the demonstration. We'll get you more practice time before the competition." But Elena had been watching Friedrich's technique, analyzing his process, and she'd identified the flaw in his approach. He was using standardized ballistic data instead of calculating for real-time conditions. His success had been partially luck, wind conditions that happened to match his assumptions. At 4,500 meters, luck wouldn't be enough. The week following the trials brought a schedule of intensive training for Friedrich and the other selected competition shooters. Elena watched from her usual peripheral position as Weber ran them through drill after drill, pushing them to extend their range and refine their technique. But something was wrong. Friedrich couldn't replicate his initial success. At 2,400 meters, he was inconsistent, landing maybe 1 round out of 5 on target. At longer distances, he missed entirely, his bullets impacting dozens of meters away from their intended marks. Weber's frustration grew with each failed attempt. "You're not adjusting for conditions," Weber shouted after Friedrich's 10th consecutive miss at 3,000 meters. "The wind is different every day, the temperature changes, you can't just use the same scope setting and hope for the best." Friedrich's face was red with embarrassment and effort. "I'm trying, Sergeant. The calculations just get too complex at this range. There are too many variables." Elena stood near the equipment shed, officially checking ammunition lots but actually tracking every environmental factor. Wind speed and direction, temperature, barometric pressure, humidity. She'd created a spreadsheet on her tablet that processed this data into scope adjustments, a real-time calculator for extreme long-range shooting. Anna Schneider approached during one of Friedrich's breaks, her medical bag slung over her shoulder. "You're doing it again," she said quietly. "The calculations." Elena didn't deny it. "Someone needs to figure this out. The competition is in 2 weeks, and our best shooter can't hit 3,000 meters consistently. So why don't you tell them what you know?" "Because they won't listen. I'm logistics, remember? I count things, I don't shoot them." Anna studied her for a moment. "You know what I think? I think you're afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Afraid that if you try and fail, it'll confirm everything they believe about you. But if you never try, you can always tell yourself you could have succeeded." The words struck deeper than Elena wanted to admit. Was that what held her back? Not their dismissal but her own fear of proving them right? She thought about it as Anna walked away, and the answer sat uncomfortably in her chest. That evening, Elena made a decision. She approached Lieutenant Brenner in his office, her tablet clutched in her hands like a shield. "Sir, I'd like to request permission to attempt the extreme long-range qualification." Brenner looked up from his computer, his expression shifting from surprise to something approaching concern. "Kovač, we've been through this. You're not a designated marksman. You're not even infantry. What makes you think you're qualified to attempt something that trained shooters are struggling with?" Elena laid her tablet on his desk, showing him the spreadsheet she'd created. I've developed a real-time ballistic calculator that accounts for all environmental variables. It processes wind speed, temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, and provides precise scope adjustments for any range up to 5,000 meters. Brenner studied the screen, his frown deepening. This is impressive work, but theoretical calculations aren't the same as actual shooting. Have you ever fired at anything beyond 300 meters? No, sir. But I understand the principles, and I've studied every successful extreme long-range shot in military history. I know what's required. Knowing and doing are different things, Kovač. Brenner handed back the tablet. I appreciate your dedication, but I can't authorize you to attempt qualification for something this high-profile. If you fail, which is likely, it reflects poorly on this entire unit. And if I succeed? You won't. I'm sorry, but that's the reality. Extreme long-range shooting requires not just knowledge but experience, physical conditioning, and mental fortitude developed through years of training. You can't get that from studying books and making spreadsheets. Elena left the office feeling the familiar weight of dismissal, but this time something else mixed with it. Anger. Not the hot, impulsive kind, but cold and calculating. She'd spent months preparing, had developed tools that could revolutionize how the military approached extreme long-range shooting, and she was being rejected based on assumptions rather than assessment of her actual capabilities. That night, she sat in her quarters and made a choice that would either vindicate everything she'd worked for or destroy her military career. She would find a way to attempt that 4,500-meter shot, with or without permission. Because proving herself had become more important than following rules that were designed to keep her in a box she'd already outgrown. The base rifle range extended far into the valley, with marked distances up to 2,000 meters for standard training. But Elena had studied the topographical maps and identified something others had overlooked. Beyond the official range, the valley continued for another 5 kilometers before rising into the alpine meadows. With careful positioning, it would be possible to establish shooting positions at distances far beyond what the range was designed for. She began her unauthorized preparation during evening hours when the range was officially closed. Using a military GPS unit and her topographical data, Elena identified a natural shooting position at 4,500 meters from a distinctive rock formation that would serve as a target reference point. She marked the position with a small reflective panel she'd requisitioned under the guise of equipment testing. The physical preparation was equally important. Extreme long-range shooting required absolute stability, and Elena's smaller frame actually offered advantages in creating a stable shooting platform. She practiced breathing techniques that would minimize body movement, learned to time her shots between heartbeats, and developed the mental focus necessary to maintain concentration through the 7-second bullet flight time. Equipment acquisition was trickier. She couldn't simply check out a precision rifle without authorization, but she discovered that the armory kept several match-grade rifles for competitive shooting that saw limited use. By carefully scheduling her equipment inspections, Elena gained access to these weapons during hours when the armory was minimally staffed. She began conducting secret practice sessions at extended ranges, starting at 1,500 meters and gradually working her way further. Each session confirmed what she'd calculated theoretically. The principles worked. With proper environmental data and correct application of external ballistics, hitting targets at extreme distances wasn't magic, it was mathematics executed with precision. But distance wasn't her only challenge. She also had to develop the physical endurance required for extreme long-range shooting. Each shot demanded absolute stillness for extended periods, requiring core strength and muscle control that went beyond simple marksmanship. Elena added specialized exercises to her fitness routine, focusing on the specific muscle groups involved in maintaining a stable shooting position. Anna discovered her secret 3 weeks before the competition. Elena was returning from an evening practice session when she encountered the medic near the equipment shed. "You're doing it," Anna said simply. "You're actually preparing to attempt the impossible shot." Elena considered denying it, but Anna's expression suggested she already knew the truth. "I have to. No one else is going to give me the opportunity." And if you're caught? Unauthorized use of military equipment, conducting training without supervision, that's grounds for disciplinary action. Then I'll face the consequences. But I'd rather be punished for trying than spend the rest of my career wondering if I could have succeeded. Anna was quiet for a moment, then smiled slightly. You're either incredibly brave or completely insane. Possibly both. What do you need? What do you mean? I mean, if you're going to do this, you shouldn't do it alone. What do you need to succeed? Elena hadn't expected support, and the offer caught her off guard. Real-time weather data. The calculations are only accurate if I have current environmental readings. But accessing that information would require someone with legitimate reasons to monitor environmental conditions, Anna interrupted. Someone like a medic concerned about hypothermia risk during extended outdoor operations. I can get you the data. Over the following week, Anna became Elena's silent partner in preparation. She provided environmental readings, helped time practice sessions, and offered the kind of moral support that Elena hadn't realized she desperately needed. But she also asked the hard questions. What happens when they find out? Anna asked one evening as they reviewed Elena's practice data. Because they will find out. You can't hit a 4,500-meter shot without people noticing. Then I'll deal with it. But at least they'll know I could do it. And if you miss? Elena had considered that possibility extensively. Then I prove them right, and I live with that. But I'd rather try and fail than never try at all. The morning of the Alpine Marksmanship Challenge arrived with cloudless skies and minimal wind, conditions that would have been perfect for extreme long-range shooting if Elena had been officially entered in the competition. Instead, she stood in the supply tent, managing equipment distribution while the real competitors prepared for their events. Camp Steiner had been transformed for the occasion. Flags from a dozen European nations flew above the main observation area, and nearly 300 spectators, including high-ranking officers and military officials, had gathered to witness the competition. The atmosphere buzzed with excitement and national pride as shooters from Austria, Germany, Switzerland, France, and other countries prepared to demonstrate their skills. Major General Hoffmann moved through the crowd like visiting dignitary, shaking hands and making small talk. Elena watched him pause at the firing line where Friedrich was preparing his equipment, offering encouragement that made the designated marksman stand a little straighter. This was Friedrich's moment, the culmination of weeks of intensive training. Elena felt no resentment toward him, only a quiet certainty that his training wouldn't be enough for what came next. The standard marksmanship events progressed through the morning with impressive displays of skill. Shooters from the German contingent dominated the 800-meter competition, while a Swiss team took top honors at 1,200 meters. The Austrian team performed respectably but didn't distinguish itself. Weber's face grew increasingly tense as the day progressed, his hope for a strong showing gradually fading. Lunch was served in a large tent near the command area, but Elena had no appetite. She'd checked the environmental conditions 3 times already, updating her ballistic calculator with real-time data. Wind was steady at 4 kilometers per hour from the east, temperature held at 19 degrees Celsius, and humidity sat at 58%. Conditions were favorable, perhaps as good as they would get. Anna found her near the equipment shed, away from the crowds. You're really going through with this? Elena nodded. The extreme long-range demonstration starts at 1,400 hours. They'll begin with the official attempts, Friedrich and the other designated shooters. When they finish, there will be a brief window before they break down the range equipment. That's when I'll make my attempt. Without authorization? In front of 300 spectators and half the general officers in the Austrian military? Yes. Anna studied her friend's face, seeing the determination that had been building for months. You understand what this will cost you if you fail? Not just embarrassment, but your career, your reputation, everything you've worked for. I understand. But I also understand what it costs to never try, to spend your life wondering if you were good enough but were never given the chance to prove it. The afternoon session began with the extreme long-range demonstration, billed as more spectacle than serious competition. The target had been established at 4,500 meters, marked with high-visibility panels that could be seen through powerful spotting scopes. A large screen displayed video feed from cameras positioned near the target, allowing spectators to watch for impacts in real time. The German team attempted first, their designated marksman firing 5 rounds that all fell short, impacts visible in the dirt nearly 200 meters before the target. The crowd applauded the effort, understanding that even getting close at such distance was impressive. The Swiss shooter came next, adjusting his scope significantly higher to account for the extreme bullet drop. His rounds landed closer, one impact showing just 30 meters short of the target. The spectators erupted in appreciative applause, and the shooter accepted congratulations from his teammates. Then came Friedrich's turn. He'd been practicing for weeks specifically for this moment, and Weber had worked with him extensively on environmental calculations. The Austrian crowd fell silent as Friedrich settled into position, his breathing controlled, his focus absolute. His first shot missed right by approximately 50 meters. The second landed short. The third came closest, impacting perhaps 20 meters from the target but still not making contact. His fourth and fifth rounds both missed left, victims of a subtle wind shift that Friedrich hadn't detected. The crowd offered polite applause for the attempt, but Elena could see the disappointment on Weber's face, the frustration in Hoffmann's posture. Austria's showcase moment had resulted in respectable efforts but nothing spectacular, nothing that would be remembered after the competition ended. 3 more national teams attempted the impossible shot, each falling short. The consensus among spectators was clear: 4,500 meters exceeded the practical limits of military marksmanship. It was simply too far, with too many variables, for consistent accuracy. The demonstration had proven interesting but ultimately confirmed what most experts already believed. Weber stepped to the microphone to thank the competitors and announced the conclusion of the extreme long-range demonstration. Elena checked her watch, 1,447 hours. The window was closing. If she was going to act, it had to be now. She picked up her equipment bag and began walking toward the firing line, her heart hammering but her resolve unshakable. Elena's boots crunched on the gravel as she approached the firing line, carrying a rifle case that she'd carefully prepared during the lunch break. Around her, the competition crowd was beginning to disperse, heading toward the refreshment tents or discussing the impressive attempts they'd witnessed. Nobody paid attention to the small logistics specialist with her equipment case. Weber was speaking with Hoffmann near the observation tower, their conversation animated as they discussed the day's results. Friedrich stood nearby, his expression a mixture of disappointment and relief that his ordeal was over. The range safety officers were preparing to clear the line and begin breaking down equipment. Elena reached the firing position and began unpacking her rifle, her movements deliberate and practiced. It took exactly 15 seconds before someone noticed. "Hey!" A range safety officer approached quickly. "The demonstration is over. You can't be on the firing line." "I'm attempting the extreme long-range shot," Elena replied calmly, continuing to set up her equipment. "You're what?" The officer looked confused. "You're not on the roster." "Who authorized this?" "Nobody authorized it. I'm attempting it anyway." The officer's confusion shifted to alarm. He keyed his radio. "Sergeant Weber, we have a situation on the firing line. Someone's attempting an unauthorized shot." Elena heard the radio chatter explode with activity, but she kept working. Rifle positioned on its bipod, scope settings adjusted based on her calculations, ammunition selected from the match-grade rounds she'd carefully prepared. She had perhaps 90 seconds before Weber arrived to physically remove her from the line. She needed to make them count. Weber's voice boomed across the range before she saw him. "Kovač! What the hell do you think you're doing?" Elena looked up calmly. "Attempting the 4,500-meter shot, Sergeant." "Like hell you are. You're unauthorized to be on this range, unauthorized to handle that weapon, and about 3 seconds from being arrested for destruction of military property." A crowd was gathering now, drawn by the commotion. Elena saw Hoffman approaching with several other general officers, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outrage. Lieutenant Brenner pushed through the crowd, his face pale with shock and anger. "Kovač, put down that weapon immediately," Brenner ordered. "That's a direct order." Elena made her decision in that moment. She could obey, pack up her equipment, and accept whatever punishment came from her unauthorized presence on the firing line. Or she could finish what she'd started, take the shot that she'd prepared for over months of secret training, and prove once and for all whether her calculations and skills were real or just theoretical fantasy. She settled into position behind the rifle, her body finding the stable platform she'd practiced hundreds of times. The scope showed her the distant target, a small speck even at maximum magnification. Through her earpiece, she heard Anna's voice providing final environmental updates that she'd promised to deliver. Wind steady at 4.2 kilometers per hour from the east. Temperature 19.3 degrees. Barometric pressure 1013 millibars. Elena input the final calculations into her mental ballistic computer, making minute adjustments to her scope settings. The mathematics flowed through her mind with crystalline clarity: bullet drop of 523 meters, wind drift of 3.2 meters right, Coriolis effect accounting for 1.8 meters left, spin drift adding another 0.4 meters right. Weber was moving toward her now, intent on physically removing her from the firing line. But he'd need to cover 20 meters, and Elena only needed 7 seconds. She controlled her breathing, found the space between heartbeats where her body achieved absolute stillness. The world narrowed to the reticle in her scope, the distant target, and the trigger beneath her finger. "Last warning, Kovač!" Weber shouted, now 10 meters away. Elena squeezed the trigger with the practiced smoothness she developed through countless hours of training. The rifle recoiled against her shoulder, the report echoing across the valley like thunder. Then came the wait. 7 seconds for the bullet to traverse 4,500 meters. 7 seconds during which the entire range fell silent, everyone watching the video screen that showed the target area. 7 seconds that felt like 7 hours. Weber had stopped his advance, frozen in place like everyone else, watching the screen. Hoffman stood beside him, his expression unreadable. Friedrich's mouth hung open in shock. The crowd of spectators, competitors, and officials all stared at the same display, waiting for impact. The bullet struck the target dead center. The impact appeared on the video screen as a small puff of dust, followed immediately by the electronic scoring system lighting up to show a perfect hit in the center ring. For a moment, absolute silence blanketed the range. Then someone in the crowd began to clap, slowly at first, then building as others joined until the applause swept across the entire assembly like a wave. Elena stood up from the firing position, her legs slightly unsteady. She'd done it. Against all odds, against all expectations, against every person who'd told her she wasn't qualified, she'd made the impossible shot. Weber reached her first, his face an unreadable mixture of shock, anger, and something that might have been grudging respect. The applause continued to echo across the range, but Elena barely heard it. She was staring at Weber, watching his expression cycle through emotions faster than she could process. Around them, the crowd surged forward, everyone wanting a better view of the logistics specialist who'd just accomplished what trained marksmen had declared impossible. "Sergeant Weber," Hoffman's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. The Major General approached the firing line with measured steps, his face carefully neutral. Behind him, a dozen other high-ranking officers followed, creating an impromptu tribunal right there on the range. Weber snapped to attention. "Sir, I can explain." "Explain what, exactly?" Hoffman's gaze shifted to Elena, studying her with an intensity that made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. "Explain how a logistics specialist accessed match-grade weapons without authorization. Explain how she fired on a competition range without proper clearance. Or explain how she just made the most remarkable shot anyone here has witnessed." Elena stood rigid, her rifle still in hand, knowing that her moment of triumph was about to transform into something much more complicated. The mathematics of her shot had been perfect, but the mathematics of military discipline were equally precise, and she'd violated multiple regulations in spectacular fashion. Lieutenant Brenner pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Sir, Specialist Kovač was explicitly denied permission to attempt qualification. Her presence on this range represents serious breaches of protocol. I take full responsibility for failing to properly supervise my personnel." "Your personnel," Hoffman repeated slowly, his eyes never leaving Elena. "Tell me, Specialist Kovač, how long have you been training for the shot?" Elena's voice was steady despite her racing heart. 11 months, sir. Since I arrived at Camp Steiner. 11 months of unauthorized training? Using military equipment and facilities without permission? Yes, sir. I understood the risks, but I believed the capability was important to develop. A German colonel stepped forward, his uniform decorated with marksmanship badges and competition medals. "General Hoffman, if I may? I'd like to understand the technical aspects of what we just witnessed. That shot required calculations that typically take our best marksmen several minutes to complete with computer assistance. How did you process that data so quickly?" Elena pulled out her tablet, showing him the ballistic calculator she'd developed. "I created a real-time environmental processor that inputs current conditions and generates scope adjustments for any distance up to 5,000 meters. It reduces calculation time from minutes to seconds." The German colonel studied the screen, his eyebrows rising. "This is remarkable work. Have you shared this with your superiors?" "I tried, sir. I was told to focus on my assigned duties instead." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Brenner's face went from red to white, understanding that his earlier dismissals had just been made public in front of officers from multiple nations. Weber shifted uncomfortably, perhaps remembering his own harsh words about Elena staying in her lane. A Swiss major joined the examination of Elena's tablet, nodding as he scrolled through her calculations. "This isn't just impressive field work. This is research-level ballistics analysis. Where did you receive this training?" "I didn't, sir. I taught myself using military manuals, academic papers, and historical shooting data. Nobody knew I was doing it." Hoffman held up a hand for silence. The crowd quieted immediately, everyone understanding that judgment was about to be rendered. "Specialist Kovač, your unauthorized actions represent serious violations of military discipline. You accessed weapons without permission, conducted training without supervision, and fired on a competition range without proper authorization. These are not minor infractions." Elena stood straighter. "I understand, sir. I accept full responsibility for my actions." "However," Hoffman continued, and Elena felt a flicker of hope, "your shot just demonstrated a capability that our military has been trying to develop through official channels for years. You've also created analytical tools that could revolutionize how we approach extreme long-range marksmanship." He paused, studying her carefully. "The question is whether you're a disciplinary problem or an asset we've been criminally underutilizing." The German colonel spoke up again. "If I may offer perspective, General. In my country's special operations community, we spend millions developing the kind of capability this specialist has demonstrated. If she developed it independently through dedication and intelligence, that suggests potential that shouldn't be wasted." Other officers murmured agreement, but not everyone was convinced. A French major stepped forward, his expression skeptical. "With respect to my German colleague, one successful shot doesn't erase unauthorized conduct. If we excuse this behavior, what message does that send about military discipline?" "It sends the message that results matter," the Swiss major countered. "That initiative and capability are worth more than rigid adherence to roles that may not fully utilize personnel potential." The debate continued around Elena like she was a chess piece being discussed by competing players. She remained silent, understanding that her fate was being decided by forces beyond her control. But she'd known this moment would come, had accepted it as the price of proving herself. Finally, Hoffman raised his hand again. "Enough. Here's what's going to happen. Specialist Kovač, you're confined to quarters pending a formal inquiry into your unauthorized activities. That inquiry will determine whether disciplinary action is warranted. He paused, then added, however, you will also be interviewed by our marksmanship development team to assess whether your analytical tools and techniques can be integrated into our official training programs. Elena nodded. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. You're not out of this by a long shot. Hoffman turned to address the crowd. This competition has demonstrated something important, that capability can emerge from unexpected sources, and that we may need to reconsider how we identify and develop talent. But it has also shown the risks of freelancing outside proper channels. Both lessons are worth remembering. The inquiry room was smaller than Elena had expected, just a plain office in the base administration building with a rectangular table and uncomfortable chairs. She'd spent 3 days confined to quarters, time she'd used to document every aspect of her unauthorized training, knowing that transparency was her only viable defense. The inquiry board consisted of 5 officers, Hoffman as presiding officer, 2 colonels from the Inspector General's staff, and surprisingly, the German and Swiss officers who'd defended her capabilities at the competition. Their presence suggested this wasn't purely a disciplinary proceeding but something more complex. Lieutenant Colonel Steiner, the lead investigator, opened the session with clinical precision. Specialist Kovač, this inquiry is convened to examine your unauthorized use of military equipment, your breach of range safety protocols, and your disregard for direct orders from superior officers. Do you understand the serious nature of these charges? Yes, sir. I understand completely. Then let's begin with the basic facts. When did you first access military weapons without proper authorization? Elena had prepared for this question, knew that honesty was her only option. Approximately 10 months ago, sir. I began studying marksmanship theory and realized I needed practical experience to validate my calculations. I accessed weapons during inventory checks when the armory was minimally staffed. You stole weapons from the armory? Steiner's tone was sharp. I borrowed them temporarily and returned them immediately after use, sir. All weapons were properly cleaned, maintained, and accounted for. No equipment was damaged or lost. One of the colonels leaned forward. That's a creative interpretation of theft, specialist. Unauthorized use of military property is a serious offense regardless of whether you returned it. Elena nodded. I understand, sir. I made a calculated decision that developing the capability was worth the risk of disciplinary action. The German colonel, whose nameplate read Hartmann, interjected. Let's discuss this capability you developed. I've reviewed your ballistic calculator in detail. The algorithms are sophisticated, the environmental modeling is comprehensive, and the real-time processing is more advanced than systems our specialized units currently use. Where did you acquire the technical knowledge to create this? Self-study, sir. I have a background in mathematics from civilian education, and I spent approximately 4 hours each night for 11 months studying ballistics, atmospheric physics, and marksmanship theory. 4 hours each night? Steiner looked skeptical. In addition to your regular duties? Yes, sir. I believe the knowledge was important. The Swiss major, Rousseau, pulled out a thick folder. We've analyzed the shot you made at the competition. The calculations required to hit that target were flawless. The environmental variables were perfectly accounted for, and the execution was textbook perfect. In my professional assessment, what you accomplished typically requires years of training in elite marksmanship programs. Or 11 months of intensive self-study, apparently, Hartmann added with something that might have been admiration. The question is whether the Austrian military wants to punish this initiative or utilize it. Steiner wasn't ready to concede. The issue isn't capability, it's discipline. Military effectiveness depends on following orders and respecting chain of command. Specialist Kovač repeatedly ignored both. Elena knew this was her moment to speak, to articulate the reasoning that had driven her actions. Sir, with respect, I didn't ignore orders because I was undisciplined. I ignored them because they were based on assumptions rather than assessment of actual capability. I was told I couldn't develop marksmanship skills because I was logistics. I was denied opportunities because of my assigned role rather than my potential abilities. So you decided rules didn't apply to you? Steiner challenged. No, sir. I decided that proving capability was more important than accepting limitations others had placed on me without evidence. Hoffman, who'd been silent until now, finally spoke. Specialist Kovač, let me ask you directly, if you could go back to that moment on the competition range, knowing what you know now about the consequences, would you still take that shot? Elena didn't hesitate. Yes, sir. Absolutely. Even though it might end your military career? Even then, sir. Because the alternative was spending my life wondering if I was good enough but never getting the chance to find out. The room fell silent. Hoffman exchanged glances with the other board members, some unspoken communication passing between them. Finally, he spoke again. This board will recess to deliberate. Specialist Kovač, you're dismissed to await our decision. Elena stood in the hallway outside the inquiry room, her hands clasped behind her back in a position of military attention that had become second nature. Through the frosted glass door, she could see the blurred shapes of the board members deliberating, their voices too muffled to distinguish individual words but loud enough to indicate heated discussion. 20 minutes passed. Then 40. The longer the deliberation stretched, the more uncertain Elena became about the outcome. Quick decisions usually meant consensus. Extended debates suggested division among the board members, which could swing either way. Finally, the door opened. Lieutenant Colonel Steiner's expression was unreadable as he gestured for her to enter. Elena walked back into the room with measured steps, taking her position at the table. The 5 officers sat in a semicircle, their faces revealing nothing. Hoffman shuffled papers before looking up at her. Specialist Kovač, this board has concluded its deliberations. The findings are complex and require careful explanation. Elena's heart hammered, but she kept her face neutral. First, regarding the charges of unauthorized equipment use and breach of safety protocols, this board finds you guilty as charged. Your actions violated multiple regulations and demonstrated a concerning disregard for established procedures. Under normal circumstances, such violations would result in court-martial and potential discharge from military service. The words landed like physical blows. Elena felt her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. However, Hoffman continued, his tone shifting slightly, these are not normal circumstances. This board also recognizes several mitigating factors. Your unauthorized training caused no damage to equipment, created no safety incidents, and was conducted with a level of professionalism that suggests you understood and respected the inherent dangers even while violating protocols. Colonel Hartmann leaned forward. Moreover, the capability you developed through this training represents a significant asset to military operations. Your ballistic calculator alone could enhance marksmanship training across multiple units. Your demonstrated shooting ability exceeds that of many specialized personnel. The question, Rousseau added, became whether the Austrian military should punish promising capability because it emerged through irregular channels, or whether we should acknowledge that talent sometimes develops outside traditional pathways. Steiner, still skeptical, spoke next. This board debated extensively. Some members argued for strict enforcement of regulations regardless of outcomes. Others contended that adaptability and initiative, even when imperfectly channeled, are valuable military traits. So here's our decision, Hoffman said, his voice carrying the weight of official pronouncement. You will receive a formal reprimand that will remain in your permanent record. You will forfeit 30 days' pay as punishment for unauthorized equipment use. These consequences are non-negotiable and will be implemented immediately. Elena nodded, accepting the punishment as fair given her violations. Additionally, Hoffman continued, and now a slight smile crossed his face, you are hereby reassigned from logistics to the base marksmanship training unit with the rank of specialist, effective immediately. Your primary duties will include developing training protocols, refining your ballistic calculator for official use, and providing advanced instruction to designated personnel. Elena's breath caught. She'd expected punishment, possibly discharge, but reassignment to the exact role she'd dreamed of seemed impossible. Furthermore, you will undergo formal evaluation for advanced marksmanship training. If you meet standards, you'll be recommended for specialized reconnaissance qualification. Your talent shouldn't be wasted counting rifles when it could be applied in the field. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Elena fought to maintain composure as the full weight of the verdict settled on her shoulders. Not destruction, but opportunity. Not punishment alone, but recognition earned through capability demonstrated under fire. 6 months after the inquiry, Elena stood at the 1,000-meter firing line at Camp Steiner, but everything had changed. The nervous logistics specialist who'd watched competitions from windows had transformed into Specialist Kovač, marksmanship instructor and advanced reconnaissance trainee. The journey between those two identities had been anything but simple. The first weeks after her reassignment were brutal. Every soldier on base knew her story. Everyone had an opinion about whether her punishment was too lenient or her promotion undeserved. Some instructors resented teaching someone who'd circumvented proper training channels. Others were curious about the woman who'd made an impossible shot under impossible circumstances. Elena responded the only way she knew how, through relentless competence. She arrived first for every training session and left last. She helped struggling shooters with the same patience she'd used developing her own skills. She refined her ballistic calculator into official software that improved accuracy rates across multiple units. Gradually, skepticism transformed into respect as her capabilities became undeniable. The German and Swiss military units that had witnessed her competition shot requested her assistance developing training programs. Her techniques for environmental analysis and mental preparation became integrated into standard marksmanship curriculum. The calculator she'd built in secret became official equipment, distributed to reconnaissance teams and specialized units throughout NATO forces. But the real transformation wasn't professional, it was personal. Elena learned that being exceptional wasn't enough, she needed to help others become exceptional too. Teaching soldiers who'd never considered the mathematics of shooting, helping them understand that marksmanship was science and art combined, gave her purpose beyond personal achievement. Standing at the firing line today, Elena watched 12 students prepare for their final qualification shoot. Among them was a young private named Sophia, small and quiet like Elena had been, assigned to logistics but hungry for something more. Elena had recognized that hunger immediately and had offered mentorship, the kind she'd never received. Remember, Elena told the group, accuracy isn't about strength or natural talent. It's about understanding variables, controlling what you can control, and accepting what you cannot. The rifle doesn't know who's holding it. It only knows whether you've done the work. Sophia took her position at the 800-meter line, visibly nervous. Elena stood behind her, quiet and supportive. The shot rang out, and the spotter called center mass. Sophia's face lit up with pride. Elena smiled, recognizing herself in that moment of triumph. This was why her story mattered, not because she'd made an impossible shot, but because she'd proven that capability could emerge from unexpected places if given opportunity and recognition. Her unauthorized training had been risky, her methods unconventional, but the result was undeniable. She'd forced a rigid system to acknowledge that talent didn't always follow prescribed pathways. As the qualification shoot concluded, Elena reflected on her journey from overlooked logistics specialist to recognized marksmanship expert. The formal reprimand remained in her record, a permanent reminder that rules mattered. But beside it was a growing list of commendations, recommendations, and contributions that proved capability mattered more. The quiet private who'd been told she wasn't a real shooter had become the instructor others sought for guidance. The woman dismissed as too small, too quiet, too focused on irrelevant details had demonstrated that those supposedly irrelevant details were actually the difference between mediocrity and excellence. Elena Kovač's story wasn't about a single impossible shot, though that moment would be remembered. It was about persistence in the face of dismissal, preparation without permission, and the courage to prove everyone wrong when it mattered most. The rifle hadn't cared that she was logistics. Neither had the mathematics, the wind, or the target. Only people had cared about those limitations, and people could learn to see differently. Looking across the range at her students, Elena understood her real achievement. She'd opened a door for others like her, the overlooked and underestimated. That legacy would outlast any record book entry. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.